Thank you all for being here. And I really want to talk about, it's called the invisible religion, and that is of the slaves themselves. It's one of the most interesting realms of American history. There's a quote here by a historian. One of the most striking events in U.S. history is the conversion of slaves to Christianity. This is from William Miller, a wonderful professor, who people wonder how this happened. How do slaves become incredibly deeply involved in Christianity? And how in the world, how do they react to slavery being taught basically the words of Jesus? So I want to go into that realm of trying to understand the invisible religion. Very quickly, we started finding out about this, believe it or not, I know this sounds crazy, but during the Great Depression of the 1930s. One thing that FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, is going to do with his New Deal is send people out to interview people for all kinds of things in history, for mountain music and all kinds of things. But also there were about 2,000 former slaves still alive in the 1930s. And their interviews were interesting, but also kind of put in a big box somewhere like, kind of who cares? It was just done during the New Deal for the Great Depression. But after World War II, and I'll just say this, World War II showed the extremes of racism as we go into the Holocaust. And that is what really launched the civil rights movement. And historians all of a sudden started looking back at this invisible religion and trying to understand, slaves would gather and sort of with a white preacher and he told them to obey their master. But let me just go through several events here where you can see how this was invisible. First of all, I just want to talk about the first time that American slaves started to see Jesus in Christianity. And I'll just say it's called the First Great Awakening. It's around 1740s, before there was such a thing as the United States of America. And this is when there was an incredible spread of preaching. George Whitefield is probably the most famous, Jonathan Edwards. But this, in fact, it was so gigantic, they couldn't even fit into churches. These were done outdoors. And this Great Awakening was very basic. It was all about the whole idea of, hey, sin and death. The only answer to that is crucifixion and resurrection. The two things that people have never been able to solve, sin and death. You've got to go to Jesus on that. This Great Awakening hit everywhere, north, south, east, west, city, country, men, women, rich, poor, but also slaves. Slaves were invited to this. And it's very amazing because also a lot of slave owners were converted. And right away there's the dilemma of, should we have slaves or not? And that is a dilemma. It was a dilemma, and it remained a dilemma. And then in the American Revolution, we start to see this real battle within America, and the founders themselves are like, I don't know if we should have slaves. Look, most of human history had always had slavery, some kind of slavery. That's just kind of the way the world was. And so for America to even get in the argument of freedom and slavery was fascinating. But for the slaves themselves, who were mostly ignored until we started reading their interviews, we started to realize, and this is another major point, for the most part, slaves were given Sunday off. Sundays were a time, unless it was the harvest time when they had to work on Sundays, slaves for the most part had the day of Sunday off. And what we have found out is that there would be meetings out in the woods, which by the way, technically was illegal, but there would be these fascinating, incredible meetings where slaves, and there would be a slave preacher. By the way, just the idea of miracles, there's certainly talk of this, that there's at least one preacher who couldn't read, but he could read the Bible. The idea of God performing miracles, we hear about this like now in dreams in the Middle East, and how slaves were being taught. And by the way, Christianity itself, y'all know, when it was born in the Roman Empire, and within about 300 years, it overtakes the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire crumbles, and Christianity, without an army, without great wealth, with lots of sacrifices, how in the world does this little bitty religion that starts out become so gigantic? And once again, it just shows the miracles and the incredible power of God in this. I wish our public schools would at least mention that. But the slaves saw it. The slaves understood a lot about this whole idea of the power of Jesus. They're two favorite people that they absolutely adored. And even if they couldn't read, the Bible is so full of stories, and they would hear stories. And there would be a few whites who would try to teach them the Bible. There were obviously not many abolitionists, if any, in the South. But the idea that God was operating within this invisible religion, their two favorite people, first the Old Testament, and that would be Moses. They loved the story of Exodus. Somehow they understood this story, this idea of slaves being freed. And then, of course, in the New Testament, they absolutely adored Jesus. Understanding that Jesus himself would not be up there with a mint julep on the plantation porch. Jesus would hang out with the lower levels of society. That's what he did. And so the amazement of them studying Jesus and his life and understanding that Jesus was a major rescue for them. Also, to understand Jesus, and Jesus mentioned this quite often, the idea of eternity. This was not, I know we think of Nat Turner and this horrible rebellion, but most slaves did not see that this world was a place for rebellion. In fact, I really saw this world as challenging and terrible and awful, yes, but it's also just a blink of an eye compared to eternity. That is why, by the way, the idea that slave funerals, which are normally allowed, it was joyous. It meant that the slave is now free in heaven. And by the way, when Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech/sermon in 1963, when it ends with free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last, we look at that and it's the civil rights movement, and it is. But it also comes from a spiritual, probably from slave times. It was actually, we know it's back in the 1890s, but a lot of scholars think that actually went back to slave times because, by the way, that entire song about free at last, it was about a graveyard. If you look at the words of that, the verses, it's about a graveyard. The idea that a graveyard was a place for real freedom. I know that's crazy in today's world of like, no, graveyards are terrible, don't visit them. But the idea of slaves seeing eternity versus the blink of an eye. And I think a lot of us living today, we are so involved in this world, even thinking about eternity is just not really on our radar. So fascination with slaves, studying Jesus and Moses. I want to get into this just a bit, and that is, what does the Bible say about slavery? The idea of obeying your master. And it's interesting what slavery meant in America, what it meant back in Roman times. And basically, the idea of most of human history, they have been slaves who worked for other people. Obvious problem with America was the racism behind slavery. Also, the breaking up of families. This was even Southern women who could, were just trying to obey, whatever their husbands did. Real interesting sort of argument among some historians. There's at least one historian who says, the average Southern woman was basically an abolitionist because she would go by and she tried to avoid it like crazy. But if you see a slave market where families are split, and where marriages weren't even legal. You just couldn't even watch that. There's other historians saying, look, these women love the wealth they got out of it, just like their husbands. It's probably, of course, there's both sides. There's truth in both sides. But the pain of this, Frederick Douglass, I love studying him. He says, he escapes from slavery and is, he kind of, when people say, well, let's look at the Bible and where, hey, slaves are supposed to obey their masters. Well, several places, and where he basically says slavery just attacks the 10 Commandments. The idea of ruining families, the idea of murder and raping that can go on, the idea of covet, that the men who normally owned these slaves were obviously just incredibly greedy. So there's the 10 Commandments. There's also Acts, of course, 17:26, which was big for the abolitionists, that all were of one blood. Several other places in the Bible where you can sort of, challenge the idea, which the abolitionists did, and they were a Christian movement, very much involved in saying that slavery is a curse to America, and America will never be this great nation if slavery is there. Abraham Lincoln called slavery a cancer that had to be taken out somehow, some way. I want to be clear that slaves, their life was just horrible in so many ways, especially the breakup of families. Especially, of course, wealth did not go to them at all. And it's the great sin, it's the cancer of American history, as Abraham Lincoln called it. But I just want to be very clear here of how slaves saw eternity as the real life. They celebrated a funeral, and how we just kind of ignore eternity. Who knows? We'll see. So there are so many incredible stories of miracles, once again, that happened with slaves. The idea I think I said about a slave who could actually read the Bible. Many things that went on where slaves felt the Spirit of God, the Holy Ghost was within them. Their incredible worship times, which, by the way, remember, are technically illegal, and slave owners may hear on Sundays, they hear out in the woods, but the next Monday, slaves were usually there, and so for the most part, it was allowed. If slaves want to go in the woods and do whatever, of course, whites had no clue what was going on, but we still see the images of that in the African American church after the Civil War. And by the way, this has been said before, America is most segregated on Sunday mornings. And a lot of that has to do with the original slave religion, the invisible religion, and then churches were allowed after the Civil War. And you started to see the churches, which you saw white churches and black churches. And I know our society right now is trying, that's a dilemma for a lot of our current churches, is how to try to get, we're all sons and daughters of God. We're all within the realm of Jesus, which is a very wide realm. And that's why slaves adored Jesus. I'll end with this, the whole idea that studying, at least study Jesus more in the public school system, study Moses, study Paul. These are turning point people in human history. And I think a lot of people expect, well, that's on Sunday. But to at least study them as much as we today study, say, Freud, John Locke, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, these become big-time speakers through a lot of school systems that we've got to know about these guys. And I know there's a lot of teachers that don't celebrate those folks, but there's also word out that, hey, folks like that are celebrated. All I'm saying is giving a fair shot and looking through the lens of slaves to try to understand Jesus and who he was, to understand Moses and who he was, and Paul, to really try to get into that realm and try to see, it could be this. Slaves were the most amazing group in the first half of U.S. history, and maybe in all of U.S. history. Because what happens is today our universities, our schools, we're so about getting our kids all about this world, get them ready for a job, do this. We're just going to ignore the idea of eternity. I'm not trying to criticize that, but it's being just totally ignored. For slaves to at least understand this world is a blink, horrible blink. It's horrible for slaves. It's a terrible thing. And for atheists, and I've taught lots of atheists, they're like, well, they just had to come up with that to try to get themselves through the horrors of slavery. And I think, of course, the slaves would be, okay, if that's what you think, that we're just, we have just made all this up, or somehow our psychology, this is what's put in, they would be very clear. No, this is, once again, the idea of miracles, the idea of the power of God in all ways on this planet, even in the horrible times of what God is doing. So, hope that wasn't too incredibly radical, but I do want to try to at least look at through the view of the slave and how slaves would be Jesus and Moses and Paul and many others, but that's, especially Jesus, Moses, but they also admired Paul. They need to be deeply explored throughout our public school system. So thank you a lot. Thank you for being here.